All right. Good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out to the 2025 Association of Wake Forest University Black Alumni Program in African American Studies Homecoming Lecture. This marks our 5th annual lecture, and so we're excited to have all of you here today for what promises to be a most exciting and inspiring and intellectually engaging event. My name is Corey Walker. I'm Dean of the Wake Forest University School of Divinity, Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities, and inaugural Director of the program in African American Studies. On behalf of our intellectual community here, we welcome you to this afternoon's conversation, which marks the beginning of our annual homecoming and reunion celebration. Go Deeks, and welcome back all Deeks. Whether gathered here in person or joining us virtually, your presence testifies to the enduring bonds that unite our Wake Forest community across time, space, and generations. From its inception, this lecture series has served as a premier forum for illuminating the profound intellectual, artistic, and moral contributions of continental and diasporic Africans to the life of the mind. Each year we gather to honor this living tradition, a tradition that has shaped the contours of human knowledge, culture, and conscience in the world. And this year's gathering promises to continue in that august tradition. This year's lecture situates us within the rich Africana literary genealogy and deepens our understanding of the intellectual vocation as a form of ethical commitment and communal witness. As the intellectual home of Maya Angelou since she was first invited to campus in 1973 by African American students for Black Awareness Week, to her acceptance of the Reynolds Professorship in 1982, Wake Forest University has hosted some of the leading scholars and thinkers in the Africana tradition. This was truly on display over a quarter century ago. In that unforgettable moment, Maya Angelou hooded Nobel laureate Toni Morrison at our 1997 commencement ceremony. This singular moment stands out in the close to 2-century history of our university as a profound statement of the power of Black women's intellectual work, artistry, and friendship that transforms institutions and elevate our understanding of human being and belonging in the world. This year's lecture will host a memorable conversation between two towering intellectuals who not only share a deep friendship, but who are literary historians and biographers of a generation of scholars who have paved the way for those of us who continue to learn and study in their wake. For me, this comes home when I, as the then young editorial assistant at Beacon Press, encountered the pages of the manuscript for Gail Jones's Mosquito. I am also reminded of a remarkable week in the summer of 2017 at Howard University, where I joined Dana Williams and a group of friends and amazing scholars combing through the archives and enjoying the hospitality of elders, learning, living, and loving the depth, density, and vitality of Black thinking and community. In addition to our esteemed lecturer this evening, today's program features our distinguished and newly inaugurated Reynolds Professor of African American Studies, Dr. Shanna Greene Benjamin. Dr. Benjamin is a leading scholar of African American literature, literary criticism, and cultural studies, whose work profoundly shapes African American studies, Black feminist thought, and gender and sexuality studies. Before joining the Wake Forest faculty, Dr. Benjamin served as professor of English and associate dean of the college at Grinnell College, one of the nation's leading and premier liberal arts institutions. Her scholarship has appeared in AB, Autobiography Studies, African American Review, the CLA Journal, Meridians, among others. Her groundbreaking research has been supported by the Ford Foundation and the American Council of Learned Societies. Dr. Benjamin's acclaimed book, Half-Life and Shadow, The Life and Legacy of Nellie Y. McKay, is a landmark in African American biography and literary history. Through this critical biography, she recovers the complex interplay of gender, race, and academic vocation that shaped the pioneering work of one of our leading African American literary studies scholars and founding figures of the Black Studies movement. By crafting a textured intellectual portrait of Nellie McKay, Shanna Benjamin illuminates the often unseen labor of Black women scholars who transformed the academy and expanded the very meaning of knowledge itself. Half-Life in Shadow opens new horizons for exploring American and African American literary studies, Black studies, and Black feminist studies, and it has secured Dr. Benjamin a stature as one of the nation's leading scholars of Black intellectual life. It is an honor to welcome my dear colleague and friend, Shanna Greene Benjamin, to the podium so that she may introduce this year's distinguished lecturer and engage in a public conversation in an event that affirms the unparalleled intellectual worth, cultural significance, and institutional necessity of Black studies here at Wake Forest University. Dr. Benjamin.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Oh, certainly. Well, good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here with you tonight and to introduce someone, and this is not hyperbole. I am here in no small part because of the influence of Dana Williams. She has been just a beacon. She has been a model for me, and I am grateful for her mentorship and for the ways that she has supported me personally and professionally. Dana Williams is Professor of African American Literature in the Department of English and Dean of the Graduate School at Howard University.
You know.
Dean Williams earned her BA in English from Grambling State University in Grambling, Louisiana in 1993, her MA in 1995 from Howard University, and her Ph.D. in African American Literature from Howard University in 1999. A recipient of the Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Scholar Award, she was a visiting research fellow at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, where she completed extensive research on her dissertation author, Leon Forrest. Before returning to Howard as a faculty member in 2003, Dr. Williams taught at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge for 4 years. In 2008 to 2009, she was a faculty fellow at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University, and she assumed chairmanship of Howard's Department of English in 2009. Dean Williams was nominated by President Barack Obama in 2016 to serve on the National Humanities Council. In 2019, she was named interim dean of the graduate school, and in 2021, she became the graduate school's first permanent female dean. Dr. Williams, yes, that deserves a round of applause. Tonight we'll be hearing Dr. Williams talk more about her book, Toni at Random, the iconic writer's legendary editorship, published in 2025 by Amistad HarperCollins. Please join me in giving a warm Wake Forest welcome to Dana A. Williams.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I will be brief at the podium, actually, but I want to say a couple of thank yous before you see a short clip from Toni Morrison. I think it's important to have her enter the space, but I have to say thank you, obviously, to Dean Walker for the invitation, to Dr. Benjamin for that warm introduction, and also for really, hopefully, modeling what it means for relationships to go two ways, because she modeled for me what it meant to write bravely about Black women with care. And then my former colleague at Howard, Dr. Alton Pollard, who I just love dearly for all of the reasons that you probably already know. And big shout out to my Graham fam. Like Derek Hicks and I go back. Derek remembers when I was 19 and we were like scrounging up trying to find books all over Grambling, all over like North Louisiana. We were joking before that our professor, upon learning that we intended to go to graduate school, had every intention for us to be completely prepared without regard to the fact that we were at a small state school and prepared to write and prepared to read, but also to prepare for the rigors by really testing us and lightweight hazing us early. And I don't even know if I can say lightweight in the sense that we read a book every Tuesday, every Thursday, and presented on that book every Tuesday, every Thursday. So by the time I got to Howard, nobody was going to outread me because I could do that. And it also taught me to what it meant even more so than what I already knew on my personal side. My personal life, I understood what community meant. I did not know similarly what community meant as an academic until we had to work together because somebody had to find the book, somebody had to find the secondary sources, somebody had to be the proofreader. He couldn't type, but he could think. So we're in community together. So I appreciate all of that. I want to open now with this very short clip from Toni Morrison that actually opens the book. And I'll talk a little bit about why I chose to open this book shortly. What she does at this conference is to tell us that she had two speeches that she wanted to give. And because she couldn't decide between the two, she was going to give them both. And essentially, one speech was about the publishing industry in general, and then about Black publishing. It was at the Writers' Conference at Howard. It was the first time that there was this publishing panel at this Writers' Conference. And part of the tension in the room was the fact that Toni Morrison was at a mainstream publishing house. What that meant, of course, is that the Black independent publishers were being run out of business. Mm-hmm. So she has to give these remarks to help them to understand why it's important for her to do the work that she is doing while they also do the work that they are doing. And I wanted to start the book with her grounded in that Black space for a particular reason. I talk a little bit about really what it means for her to be an editor at a mainstream house in 1976, having by then published several books. So midway, really page 4 of the book, I talk a little bit about why she's significant. And I'll read a bit here. Few editors could have made the kind of statement that Toni Morrison had made. What she claimed in that clip was that the survival of Black publishing meant the same things that the survival of anything Black depends upon, which is the energies of Black people, sheer energy, inventiveness and innovation, tenacity, the ability to hang on, contempt for those huge monolithic institutions and agencies which do obstruct us. In other words, we must do our work. That's her quote. And again, it could have felt patronizing to some, but instead, we had Morrison saying that the responsibility for the survival of Black writing did not depend on Madison Avenue or the United States government or anyone else for that matter. It depended on the writers and readers alone. But Morrison was no ordinary writer or editor, so she did not experience the contempt someone else might have. She was a published writer who had been warmly received by the establishment, but still grounded in Black culture, so much so that her name had actually become a household name by then in Black literary communities and beyond. She was the editor of books by Black authors who would have likely continued to languish in relative obscurity, absent her determination to get their work in print. Editor of writers like Huey P. Newton, Angela Davis, Muhammad Ali, celebrities who were able to tell the stories in their own way. If the job of the publisher was to make money by investing in the creativity of writers, then the job of the editor, she told the crowd, was to take that creativity and translate it into something readers felt was alive and needed to be captured permanently on the page. Near the end of the talk, someone poses a question, or at the end of the talk, just about at the end of the question and answer session. This question came from an attendee who was dressed in a 3-piece suit and who had perfect enunciation. He clearly fancied himself sophisticated, directing his question at no one in particular. He wanted to know, quote, how to go about raising the intellect of the reading public, end quote. Halfway through his long-winded question, Morrison reached into her suit jacket pocket to retrieve a cigarette. Before she could locate a lighter, she looked quickly from left to right at her fellow panelists and then grabbed the microphone. which sat between her and another panelist. No one asked me to respond, she blurted out, but we don't need that. Punctuating each word, she added, we know how to appreciate elegance. We always have. We've always been very fastidious people. The problem, in her estimation, was getting the book to the audience, not the audience's response, once they had the book. For over 45 minutes, Morrison fielded questions alongside other panelists until the question and answer period finally ended. Just as they were about to close, she insisted, quote, while there may not be many stores that are restocking or stocking Black books, and while there may not be many Black bookstores, and while there may not even be places where editors can get interviews for their books, while there may not be places on television, radio, and so on that will give us the opportunity to distribute or publicize our books, there is one other thing. And there's always been that other thing, and that's us. We all we got. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'll pause our reading here.
All right, so what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to start with some big issues, and then we're going to kind of taper into some small, more specific stuff. I told Professor Williams before we started, a little inside baseball, if you will, because, once you've written a biography and then you start reading other biographies, you get really, really curious about all of the choices that go into making it happen. And so we'll have time to talk about craft and that sort of thing toward the end. But I wanted to start with this kind of basic question: why this book and why this approach?
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I'll try to give the super condensed version. So I started thinking about this project as my dissertation project. I was in a class with Eleanor Traylor, who I talk about a lot in the book, and there's a non-traditional acknowledgments, I must say, myself. Like, I was trying not to make it a chapter, but it wanted to be, so I just went with it. 3 pages on one person in the acknowledgments. She and Toni Morrison were very close, and Dr. Traylor and Morrison had taught together for many years. They exchanged ideas all the time, so typically she would be reading alongside Ms. Morrison. So she decided to teach this course on contemporary African American lit, focusing on the writers that Toni Morrison edited at Random House. And I didn't know this. I'm just interested in contemporary African American fiction. I take the class, and I say, why these books? And she casually says, oh, these are the books that Toni edited when she was at Random House. And I go, ma'am? What? Like Henry Dumas, Gail Jones, Toni K. Bombard, Leon Forrest, and John McCluskey. So the more we talk about it, the more I'm interested in this project as my dissertation project. And I'm hard-headed. So she says, it's too big for a dissertation project. And I'm like, no, I'm doing it. And like 6 months later, I'm like, this is too big for a dissertation project. And so she says, pick one of the writers and, get on about your business. And so basically she says, pick Leon Forrest, because very little has been written on Forrest. I said, okay, but I'm coming back to this project. I want to come back to this project. Fast forward, I'm at Northwestern. Toni Morrison is giving the Leon Forrest lecture upon on the anniversary of his transition as ancestor. And we talked very briefly after. I'm talking to Toni Morrison about Leon Forrest. And although he's at Northwestern and people love him and people are endeared to him, most people hadn't read Leon Forrest. So she kind of looking at me like, why do you know this about Leon Forrest? And I said, I had taken this class with Dr. T on the editorship, and I'm really interested in the editorship. I wanted to do it initially, and she said, kind of offhand, well, if you whenever you begin to take up the project, let me know. I'm happy to do anything to help. At that point, I'm like, bet. I got Toni Morrison on board for a project that I'm really interested in. I talked to her a bit about what I wanted to do with the project, which was to stick with the fiction writers, contextualize her, and to begin to think about this aesthetic. The Norton Anthology of African American Literature wasn't that old at the time, but it was still a big enough deal. Every period has very clear delineations. You get to the end, and it's just literature after 1970. It had no name, it had no color, it had no character. So it's like, what is this literature after 1970 that is doing this work? So I'm thinking, like, I want to do kind of period formation. I want to think about what this period is and think about the outsiders. What is this movement after the Black Arts movement, right? So I go to her office at Princeton. We're sitting down, we're having interviews. She knows what I want to do, and she talks about everything except for the fiction writers. And I say, thank you, but can we talk a little bit about the fiction? And she said, we'll talk about that next time. So I'm excited on the one hand, because there's going to be a next time. And I'm also like, what am I supposed to do with like all of this now? And I'm also taking notes, longhand, like trying to make sure that I get everything, because she also says, you can record, but I'll be less candid. So listen to myself, all right. And I got good ethics, so I'm not gonna record anyway. Right. I'm just like gonna write down everything and like try to go longhand. Fast forward a couple of interviews in, and I realized that I am being edited by Toni Morrison, and I don't even know it. Because the project was supposed to be just about editing these writers, the fiction, and like this period. And she intentionally, I think, talked about everything except for that, because she knew that the book needed to be about the editorship itself, which I thought was fascinating, because she was like disinterested in me talking about her literature. She's like, enough people are doing that. Yeah. Nobody talks about the editorship, and it was really hard work. Right. So that then became the reason that I said, all right, I'm going to broaden this project out, even as I'm intimidated by this project. And I was also reluctant, because while I was interested in literary history, I wasn't a literary historian. In the same way that we don't get trained to teach, we don't get trained to be literary historians. You figure it out. But I figured, I could figure it out if I had the cooperation of the person whose work it was. And so we just started going back and forth about what books were there that were included. Because at this point, she's operating on memory. And we don't know exactly where the archives are for Columbia for those years. It took a while even just to literally locate where they were, because they had not been processed. And then the approach shifted from academic to trade shortly after she had made transition, and I talked to an editor about it. And she had talked to me about it just a little bit, saying, you can do whatever you want to do with the book. I was very comfortable with it being a university press. Less comfortable with it as a trade book. And we began to play around with what the possibilities were. But then I felt like now I'm on my own after she had transitioned. And so I talked to a couple of editors, and they were like, this can definitely be a trade book. So then I had to shift 400 academic pages into trade writing. And that was the condensed version.
Yes. Well, so now I'm interested in the shift. Because as you were talking, I was thinking about voice. I was thinking about how Morrison operated as an editor, and how ultimately she was trying to really draw out what was true about the writer's voice. And so I'm curious about how making that shift from academic writing, she talks about it when she's editing Angela Davis, that's something that she has to prune from the book. I'm curious to know, what did you do differently in terms of your storytelling in order to animate this part of Morrison's life?
Literally allowed myself to be a storyteller as opposed to someone who was making an argument that I had to prove. So the whole thing was, I was like, there had to be a thesis. I had to have supporting points. I needed citations. Like, it was like traditional, I can do this. I know how to do this. This may not excite me, but I can do it, and I can do it well. It was actually the panel that we were on together at Jackson State for the 50th anniversary. Couldn't have been 50. What year was it? The anniversary of Phyllis Wheatley. No, it was the 50th anniversary of Margaret Walker's celebration of Phyllis Wheatley at Jackson State. 3-4 days, wonderful conversation. We were on a panel together talking about Black women writers, and I'm very comfortable storytelling for a conference. And the paper that I was giving was on literary friendships. Like how Toni Morrison became friends with Barbara Chase Rabeau, and friends with June Jordan, and friends with Lucille Clifton. And I was working on that chapter at the time. I finished the talk. I did not know, because I had only met my editor on Zoom. Because COVID, right? Yeah. I wasn't thinking there are 75, 100 people in the audience. And patiently, the person who is the editor for the book waits, and she then introduces herself, extends her hand and says, hey, Dana, I'm Abby West. And I go, hi, Abby. And then I go, oh, snap, this is my editor, Abby West. And she said, that's how you write the chapter. Because she had seen all the other chapters and she's like, you're killing us, these are dead.
Yeah.
Like, they gotta have rise and fall.
Yeah.
And I was like, this isn't a novel. You don't understand me, you know? And she's like, no. And I was like, oh, I could write a book that tells stories.
Yeah.
Like, I told stories my whole life. So it was literally just turning my brain from just tell the story. Because it was the case in the same way that the chapter opens with that we got. If you listen to the archive, it will tell you what it wants you to say.
That's right. Yeah.
And I wasn't listening to the archive. I was like, here's my argument. Here's how I'm going to tell this story. And once I pulled back and listened to the story that the archive was trying to tell me, it became much easier.
So I'm fascinated by that idea of listening to the archive, because I did take a look at how you gathered the evidence, the letters, the memos, the notes, the speeches, and when you narrate all of the detail, even though we couldn't see it, even though it was grainy, all of the nuance of her movements, her reaching for the cigarette, it was just absolutely masterful. If you don't already have it, on sale right outside, as you remember. But the point I want to make is this. So I'm curious to know how you built the archive. One of the things that remains consistent across Black women's biography is this kind of failure within the archive to preserve and to protect and to value the papers that historians, that biographers would need to tell these stories. Did you go to traditional archives? Did you have to form relationships and get people to kind of go digging around in their closets and attics to get you the stuff? Tell me a little bit about the process that you undertook to get the resources that you needed to write the book.
It was a combination of things. So once I realized that the archives were at Columbia, and by then they had processed most of them, and then I had a sense of how to negotiate them even when they weren't processed. So the finding aid for the Random House archives, the finding aid is 85 single space pages. So then you also have to know what to look for. And these are like PDFs that don't have the metadata behind them. So you're literally combing through one thing by one thing by one thing. And I knew what writers I was looking for. But I didn't know all of them. So it was the case that I would get in a box that's like box 1160, and I'm looking for Leon Forrest, but then I got to go through and see what else. I'm like, why is this in this box? And I open it up, and then I see, okay, she signed this, so now I got to write this person down. Now I got to go figure out what else this person. And then there are expense reports, because I also want to be able to tell the story about how she met the person. Where did they go to lunch? How long did they have conversations? Like, what fostered the trust, like all of these things. So now I got to go to not editorial files. Now I got to go to her expense reports. And then I got to go to her rejection letters. And so it really is a piecemeal, like you figure it out. And that's part of why I'm saying the archive will tell the story. And then it's still very difficult for me to say like the upside of COVID. I hope we find some language to it, because I don't think with that many people who lost their lives. But we were home, people were more familiar with Zoom, and everybody I had been stalking for years said yes. Like, so I'm like trying desperately to get people, and it wasn't that they were saying no, because there was not a single person I made a request for an interview who said no, not one. They either didn't respond at all. Gail Jones, I never could even get a point of contact for Gail Jones. I tried desperately. But then there were a couple of people who I just didn't hear from until later. But everybody else said yes, did Zoom interviews, and I had enough information that I could say, all right, even with Angela Davis, I say, okay, the Bantam report says this, and she says, oh my goodness, I don't remember that way, send that to me. And I'm able to share screen, and then she says, oh, this is what this, and I'm like, and I don't understand this, explain this point to me, and she says, oh, that's because that person was my lawyer at this point. So it's a back and forth and verifying, because I also can't just take you at your word. I mean, 90% of me is just like whatever you say, but then I also got to trust and verify, because there's that kind of journalistic impulse that's there as well. And finally, I'll say, I always wanted to see what was on the other side of the archive. Because with Toni K. Bumbar, for instance, a real quick thing, I would like, the correspondence just drops off. So I like tell Toni Morrison, I'm like, there's just a big gap. And she's like, oh, she was staying with me that week. So then what do you do? Because Toni K. Bumbar is no longer with us, but I'm trying to understand, everything is well documented when y'all are going back and forth with letters in Atlanta. And I can get a phone call, but then it's just like nothing. Like no notes on the manuscript. She's like, she'd go upstairs. I tell her something. She said, and I just point and grunt and she fix it and she come back down. So then that becomes like when I'm talking about Toni K. Bumbar, the way that I have to tell this story has to fit my lack of information, which then forces me not to tell a stale story with Toni K. Bumbar. This story has to be about the fact that y'all mama know y'all are good friends. Yeah. So then the chapter becomes the two Tonys as opposed to, here's a really interesting conversation about Toni K. Bumbar. So then I went to the archives at Emory because I needed to see the letter that Toni K. Bumbar received back from Toni Morrison, because sometimes in the archive there is the letter that Morrison sent, the copy, and then you get the side that the other person, but what we also discovered was there was some stuff in her archives at Princeton. I was like, ma'am, this should have been in the Random House. Why you take this home? So there's also that practice in the archive that people like make decisions about what they want people to know and what they don't want people to know. So there were some things that I stumbled upon later. It's like, I couldn't find this. Like, I didn't see this correspondence with you and Evan Van Sertima. Why? And she's like, I don't know. I might have been working from home that month. I don't know. At that point, I got to figure out, is she working on Song of Solomon? Like, what's happening? So you follow the breadcrumbs enough to be able to tell the story the way that it wants to be told.
Yeah. So another thing that struck me as you were talking about the Zoom interviews has to do with something I've discussed before, is intimacy as methodology when we're talking about writing the life stories of Black women and the need to build trust and to be trusted and to have someone to vouch for you and to say, you can give her access, she's all right, she's with me.
Yeah.
There's also this idea that biography is in some way objective. Can you talk about how you used your closeness with Morrison, your closeness to the subject matter, as a point of strength and not as a deficit?
Yeah, I'm very clear that I got access even to Toni Morrison because Dr. T said at some point, she good people. She's good. I mean, otherwise it would have been like a kind of traditional yes, no, here's the time. But our best conversations, even the title of the book was like at Dr. Trela's house at a New Year's Day party. And I grew up in the South, so I know better than to like impose on people's being in that space. I'm at Dr. T's like kind of casually, not a graduate student, but still young enough with the elders in the space that I'm gonna do whatever she tells me to do.
Yeah.
So she says, run upstairs and bring me whatever. She also knows that at this point I'm dodging Toni Morrison because I'm 4 or 5 years in and I don't have a book yet. So I don't really want to talk to her because I'm embarrassed or whatever. So she's going to send me upstairs knowing that she's in the room that she sent me to. So I get to the top of the stairs, I go in, and she says, oh, hey. And I'm like, hi. She said, so how was it going? And I'm not going to bring it up. I'm just going to be like, hey, how are you? Good. She says, so how's it going? I'm like, what's good? What's happening? We're like being casual. She says, how's the book? And I say, I'm not making as much progress. I was like, well, you know, I became chair. And like, I have all of these other things. And she says, all right. So I said, but I do have a title. Because we had talked in interviews about how difficult titles are. She says, the first thing, like the person sees the jacket and then they see the title. You got to give people a reason to pick up a book. And I said, okay. I was like, I have a title. It's The House That Toni Built at Random. I'm proud of myself. Toni Morrison, Random House. I'm like, yeah, right? Like, it's cute.
Get it?
Yeah. I was like, the house. And she says, too long. And I'm like kind of crestfallen because my one little achievement is not there. And so she says, Toni at Random. And I say, Toni at random, Toni at random. She says, Toni at random. And we go, okay, that works. That didn't happen in an interview. That happened because I'm getting ready to get some black eyed peas and rice and to make sure the cornbread doesn't burn. That was my assignment. Baby, go check the cornbread. And she knows that she's in the kitchen. So I have to be mindful that I don't take advantage of that level of intimacy while also understanding that the way that you tell a person's story as a tender story is made possible by the fact that I've seen you in tender spaces and not just on the page. I've seen you be incredibly generous. And even as I've also seen, I mean, it was clear to me sometimes that she wanted to be somewhere else or she had something else on her mind. And even then I knew, all right, I need to shift this conversation to unlock this in a way. And for me, often it was Toni K. Bombara. Like there are certain people that she would talk about and then she'd be like, oh, and like the body language would change and the energy would shift. So being attentive to that level of intimacy and saying, all right, something else is going on with her right now. I don't know what it is, but I got to bring her down. Like her energy is different from what it needs to be. So to try to move in the space in a way that was completely respectful. There are times that we talked and I left the space without anything that I thought was useful outside of, okay, think about this in a particular way. So I think she gave me far more space and far more latitude than she might have otherwise. And then I think similarly, she had an expectation of me that I don't think she would have had of somebody else. So I also had to live up to, all right, here's the thing. We were at a conference, and she was, again, generous with me. It was daunting in some ways, but I also felt like I was completely prepared. I had talked to Dr. Peterson-Reed. I just wanted to be able to say that, yes, because she was an undergraduate student, and she was actually in the first class I worked on teaching. Like I was trying to pull this book together, and she was one of the undergraduates in a grad class for that. And we talked a lot about how important it is to think through a thing all the way as best as you possibly can. You might not necessarily know all of it, but you got to think through it and respect the space enough to have people be able to tell you, this is my expectation of you. In the same way that I would tell them, I said, this is the ethic I expect. So we're at a conference, 3 conferences actually, and every time I gave a paper, she was in the room. So you're giving your paper on Toni Morrison's Howard years at Howard University, and she's there like, no. I wouldn't interpret that way. I mean, she wasn't saying that out loud. I'm just reading her, right? But again, she's like, this girl is getting enough of this right that I gotta, okay, I see what this is. I see how she can do this, because the part of that kind of tangent was to suggest how her intellectual formation was influenced by her upbringing. So a book about her editorship isn't biographical in terms of this is who she is, but I was like, understanding her as a performer because she had been an actress, understanding her as a dancer, understanding like just literally how she shows up in the world is in part performance. And she knew exactly how to use her voice, exactly how to use language. So fast forward into the session, and we're just sitting there talking casually, and Paula Giddings, who is there, and Paula Giddings had worked at Random House as an editorial assistant. Paula Giddings' Ida's Sword Among Lions had just come out. And so she said, Dana, have you seen Paula's book? And I said, yes. And she picks it up. She says, this is a book. It's like 800 pages. And I was like, what you saying, ma'am? And she's like, I'm not saying anything outside of the fact that this is a book. Basically, girl, not write a book. Like, write a book.
Write a book.
Yeah. Don't play with this. Write a book.
Yeah. So you mentioned that this may not be a biography in a kind of traditional alpha to omega sense. But as you talk about her life as a performer and as a dancer, I like the way, now there are pieces that are coming together for me about how you prime us for what comes next in terms of how Morrison manages the writers, how she manages the folks at Random House, how she gets the work done.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious about her interior. And even though it's not a traditional biography, I was always looking for glimpses into a side of Morrison that I didn't know anything about, or that was new to me. So I'm curious to know, I mean, you've been with Morrison for so long, Toni Morrison Society, all of what you've taught and written about. What did you learn about Morrison that you didn't know already? What surprised you? What was new? And what facets of her interior do you think this book brings to the fore?
Yeah, it was, we talked a little bit about this in that last question, whether I said it directly or not, but I had to make a decision about how much of the interiority outside of the editorship I was going to bring forward, and made a decision not to talk a lot about like the anguish she experienced as she is sleeping 4 or 5 hours a day sometimes, because she's getting up, she's writing, or the tension that she had to negotiate at Random House, or how I talked about the tension, but how she felt about the tension. Quick story about it, and I hope I remember to come back to the previous point. When Morrison becomes the senior trade editor at Random House, it is because Charles Harris, the first black male editor there, actually gets pushed out. He goes to Howard to found Howard University Press, so he lands well. But I said, what's that experience like for you? And I did tell her, I've already talked to Charles Harris, so let's be clear. Because that too is a part of the research process for me. I wanted to hear Charles Harris's side of the story, even though this book ain't about Charles Harris. Like, I'll write an article about Charles Harris someday, and somebody should write a book about Charles Harris someday, because he's like an incredible editor himself. He's actually the person who gets the Muhammad Ali contract. He's a big part of the reason she's able to do what she's able to do. So when we're talking about how do you feel knowing that you got moved up because they pushed this guy out? What are the implications? Is this just a job? Do you defend him? How does all of that go? So so that's a part of the conversation that I'm trying to figure out, where does that belong in a book, or does it belong in a book at all? What I decide to move to the fore in terms of how she is experiencing this at the interior level is how she's corresponding with people who are not always being kind. She's in a conversation with artists all the time who are essentially disrespectful to her. There's a guy who shows up in her office basically unannounced and decides that he's going to tell her how to edit his book. And she endures it, but writes him a nice little letter that says, listen, I can't be strong-armed. Generally, it makes me angry and uncooperative. So, like, if you decide to trust your publisher and trust your editor, okay. If not, we won't do this. And so those were the kinds of things that she would talk a little bit about, like, it's not worth the conversation. But with June Jordan, for instance, when she and June Jordan, two black women who are both in New York at the same time, both of whom are trying to find ways to work both within the system and outside of the system. Morrison is being strategic about also trying to feed information about what it takes to be a mainstream publisher to black women who are trying to start their own press. I'm like, so what happened? Why y'all couldn't figure that out? And she said, June got mad about the title of a book. And I just, I didn't have the patience for it. We had 4 arguments, and my limit was 3. Like, and literally, you would see in the correspondence where somebody would get angry, and Chinweso sends her a note, hangs up the phone in her face, and she's got to go to sales conference to pitch this book to people. And so she writes him, and he's like apologetic, and she says, don't worry, Chinweso, I don't stay mad at people, just institutions. So it was that kind of, I didn't know that to be true. I didn't know that. Make sure that's not me. Oh, it's not. Good. Okay. It's like, I don't know who it could be. I don't stay angry at people, just institutions. And so talking to her about, like, what does that mean? And so she says, I couldn't. Like, there was something endemic about an author's relationship with the editor that says, like, there's going to be one point of tension because, and Melvin and I were talking about this earlier, your editor, like, y'all got a like intimate relationship. And you got one idea about the thing and the editor is telling you something else. She's like, I don't know if I believe you. I don't know if you're right. And the editor's saying, I'm right, trust me. And you're like, I don't. So, or maybe I do. So I think that was where I decided to go with the kind of, let me see what it means for her to think about being in this space as an institution. And I, even as one of my favorite quotes in terms of like snippets for the book is something that Vulture published that says, what's better than literary gossip? Nothing, right. Like, everybody loves literary gossip. I was okay with that. I was also very careful as a writer. I'm not going to tell the gossip.
Yep.
Like, I'm not the interior. Like, there's certain conversations that when I see people, I'm like, mm-hmm. Or anytime, like, in the conversation with Angela Davis, if she says, now you can't tell this, but. So I was also careful to let it be background as though I were a journalist, but not have the whole conversation.
Yeah.
And there are lines that people can read in the archives that I still thought, if I put this in, the whole chapter will be about that instead of about the bigger thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, Corey, I was thinking maybe one more question. Okay. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So I was thinking, let's see, which of the two? So I was thinking about the structure and kind of the way that you layered Toni Morrison's work as an editor atop her emergence as a novelist. And, you know, I'm thinking about them because I think about these things visually, that there's kind of a slow build with her work as a writer, and then what is then the priority in terms of her work as an editor. They switch places. How long did it take you to figure out that was going to be part of the structure of the book? I thought it was a really elegant way for you to end. By giving us, this is Song of Solomon, this is what's happening to her, you know, as she pulls back from her work at Random House, and she has time to just devote her life to being a writer. Talk about that choice and talk about how that emerged for you as a way to manage what was going on with her personally and what was happening with her professionally.
Yeah, because with a book like this, is like, that's not chronological.
Yeah.
It's difficult to know where to end it, such that it's not abrupt. And the reality of her life was around 1978, she's just basically saying, I'm not taking on any new writers. Anybody that I edit at this point has to be someone, like, this is my second or third or fourth book with that person. But she was really clear that the more attention she could give her own writing, the less work she was going to do. By then, she's only going in the office half time, but still at full-time pay by and large. She was still not completely convinced that she could make a living writing. And we kind of sort of joked about that. She's like, yeah, I grew up in the Depression. There was never enough money. Like, there was not enough money that she could make, because even after she stopped editing, because she wanted to be a full-time writer, she was then teaching.
Yes.
So part of the decision was to have it reflect the reality, but also help us to understand how these things were so closely intersected that you couldn't ever take one out for the other. There was never a period where she wasn't still thinking about it, because even when she's writing almost exclusively, she pauses to read off the record so many people's work. She does Toni K. Bambara's book on the record. She does the book on Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas on the record. But she is still doing the work, and so that flow has to go back, and I think it had to be kind of a back and forth.
Yeah.
I would say it almost wrote itself in the sense that there was one chapter that I had to take out completely because just the book was too long, and publishers are thinking about how many books will fit in a box. Literally, how many books will a bookstore buy in terms of its stock? Like most bookstores now, if they're brick and mortar, can't do these kinds of books.
Okay.
So part of it was I got to figure out also how to move from this period to this period with these 2 missing chapters.
Yeah.
And then also bring the reader back full circle to this is the Toni Morrison I knew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Please, let's give her a round of applause. So questions?
Oh, sorry, there's something in my eye. First, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your, as you mentioned, I was in that. Am I loud enough? Okay.
Yeah, we're recording, so sorry for everyone.
It was really nice to hear and see how this all came to fruition. As you mentioned, I was in that graduate course, which was very much a struggle for me as a senior undergrad trying to figure out, do I even want to do this? But I would really like to hear you talk about, the archive, and that's something I'm always interested in. Not only the archive, but the felt presence in gaps in our archive. Like when you think about, just not even literary history, but the literary history of Black women specifically, even with all the strides we've made, there's still so much we probably don't know.
Yep.
So just hearing you talk about, the question of keeping some things, particularly around the interiority, out of the book, did you ever at any point reckon with, am I perhaps contributing to this gap in the archive by leaving certain things out, and that perhaps sometimes it's best to have a gap, whether to protect the writer or just that there are certain things that just don't need to be known to the wider reading community?
Yeah, so many, a couple of things came to mind with that response, or with your question. One, I think, is I was always afraid that I would miss something. And that's every academic, right? That's every academic. And then I'll tell anybody who is like student, junior faculty, getting ready, listen, just get smart friends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that's what you have to say to yourself. Because you're scared to death you're going to miss something. And then you say, listen, I got smart friends. They're not going to let me look stupid. Mm-hmm. So then you pass it out and say, is anything sticking out for you? And if smart people say, you're good, there is still somebody wrote to me and said, this is a beautiful book, it's blah, 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 but the Muhammad Ali dates are wrong. There was one error in the Muhammad Ali date and he actually got the championship on whatever, with fighting this person as opposed to this. I'm like, okay, I can receive that. But something glaring missing was always just this fear, but you gotta let it go and have whatever disclaimer there is. And if there's a second edition where you reprint, you make the correction.
Yep.
So that was the first thing in terms of the gap and silence, what if I miss? Mm-hmm. Then you have stories that you're trying to tell. And sometimes when you find something, the story doesn't hold up anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I had narrated her bravado almost, or how to her nerve, gosh, I don't even know how to describe it. She would tell people off, and there was no reason that the only Black woman at a firm should have had the nerve to do that. Just literally. So at one point they say, the next time you must ask for permission for overtime pay, you don't have the authority to allow this person to work overtime as a typist. So Toni K. Bumbar had lost her typist, and she tells this woman, you type it and I'll pay you overtime. Accounting comes back and is you don't have the authority to do that. She says, well, if we don't have the money for it, let me know. I should start looking for another job. If we're not going to pay people for their labor. I'm like, who does that?
Yep.
What kind of, another quick example, she does this book, Creole Feast, which is a cookbook, 10 Black chefs in Louisiana who have essentially been paid under the table their whole lives, so they don't have Social Security. So the editor of the book is going to try to get them together, and they're going to get in a union. And she says to the accounting team, the difference between they're getting an advance now when I'm asking for it and 3 months from now is they lose their opportunity to like live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Give me the money. So I'm like, who is this person who has this kind of nerve? And she does this not just with the accountants, but with her editor-in-chief, like anybody, she'll tell anybody off.
Yep.
Like in a nice, nasty way. So I had set this whole thing up about like she had become this great author and she's so respected, and this is like she grew in nerve as she stayed there. And then I find a memo from 1968 where the editor-in-chief is asking her about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, whether or not it's racist. And she's got 4 pages about this is why. Yes, it is. And the only reason I would let my child read it would be to show him how systemic racism and white oppression has blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, she had this nerve in 1968. I can't tell that story that way anymore. Like, she came here like this.
Yep.
So you do have to think about, like, what am I missing? What are the gaps? What needs to be told? What doesn't need to be told? How can I tell this in a way that like remains true? And then the other compromise that I would not give up, even as I think the team tried to get me to move out of it, was the footnotes. Like, if I can't tell you this whole story, I'm gonna put it in a footnote, because the scholar in me was like, I still gotta have a disclaimer. So that is how I tried to address like the gaps.
I'll just do my best to project. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing with us today. The question I have is, how would you describe Toni Morrison's editorial approach, or key editorial values, if you will? What guided her decisions when shaping or selecting the works that she published?
I asked her that question like 5 times. Like, I just kept asking the same question, and she just like finally huffed like, okay, you gotta have an answer, because she just said it would change from book to book. And I was like, yeah, but like there had to be something that you were always looking for. And she said, all right, if I gotta answer this question, I always wanted the book to be written in a way that the only person who could have written this book was that person. And I wanted to edit the book in a way that the only way this book was gonna look the way that it looked was if I did it. So that aesthetic, if you will, was anybody could write this book, but what do you bring to this book uniquely that nobody else can tell? That was the thing she was always looking for. So with Leon Forrest, who was writing a beautiful book about Black male interiority after the loss of a parent, but also trying to bring it into like historical significance. So as he's driving in this hearse, or he's riding in a hearse, the procession for his mother's funeral, he's also seeing all of these people from Black history, because now these kids got to figure out, like, who am I now that I don't have a mother? And what does it mean to be Black in this space? So he's like, she's like, to some degree, anybody could have told that story, but what is it that you can do that's very different? Like, all of this stuff you're doing, like with experimentalism and like this kind of Black models are cute, what's the thing you can do better than anybody else? And at that point, it becomes about the language and the culture, and how do I tell this story in a way that makes it not just about Black interiority, which is what she was attracted to about it, but which also negotiates that tension between the Black Arts Movement moment and the post-Black Arts Movement moment. Because her tension was, like, I don't want to do any more Black Arts Movement books. I appreciate the movement. I want to take the good of it and see where the next iteration of it was. So, like, really getting him to say, you're steeped enough in culture, like, I don't hear language, I don't hear this. And so it's a sermon, for instance, that she says, all right, and now I don't have to look to William Faulkner anymore. When I'm trying to hear a sermon, I can read this. Because you get this coming out of a Black Baptist tradition, a Black Catholic tradition, having worked for Muhammad Speaks, you understand Black life like nobody else does. And particularly Black religious life, as an example.
Thank you so much.
Folks, let us thank Dana Williams.
Thank you.
It's been an amazing fifth edition of the AWFUBA AAS African American Studies Homecoming Lecture. And I want to give a special thank you to an individual who makes all of our events work and who's just an amazing individual, an amazing colleague, and most importantly, an amazing spirit, Sarah Goldstein.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, although we're ending the formal program at this moment, we do have our colleagues at Bookhouse, at the Bookhouse, located right in Reynolds Village, our Reynolds Village, Wake Forest, right up the street. We can just walk through the woods. The Bookhouse, we use the Bookhouse all the time for our literary events, and the Bookhouse has copies of Toni at Random available. And of course, Dana is available to sign them. And we also have a wonderful reception right next door so we can continue the conversation and continue our dialogue. But for tonight, our formal program, thank you so much, dear friends. And thank all of you for coming, and we look forward to our next conversation.